Yes, it's a great honor, and I'm very excited to be invited here and to speak to you about the subject that I study, research, practice, and love for the last several years. Um, and yes, since we had this technical issue at the beginning, I will try to maybe speed up a little bit, although I tend to speak a lot. So hopefully, I will not extend this dedicated time that we have. Um, I do assume that you guys know something about psychedelics and psychedelic experiences, so I will just give a little bit short of an introduction, and then I will go to the subject of my presentation right away afterwards. Um, so when we um, talk about psychedelics, we actually talk about a very broad range of psychoactive substances which have tremendous potential and lots of different effects actually um, influencing every aspect of human experience. And perhaps it's best described by the very names that were used over the last decades to describe these substances, depending on the context in which they were applied. And psychedelics, of course, is this term that, let's say, won a race for the discourse, and that's what I am using it as well. So mind manifesting or mind revealing or soul revealing substances. Um, there are also a growing number of theories about how psychedelics work on human brain and mind and what benefits, what therapeutical potentials derive from this specific psychedelic effects. And recognitions of these potentials led to extensive research, basically from the very beginning when the Western culture discovered these substances. Shortly after 1950s, we started to apply them in the context of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. This research peaked in the late 60s, then it was halted by the war on drugs. But recently we observed basically the last 20 years again, um, many research focused on psychedelic assisted therapy and psychedelic understanding or understanding of psychedelics itself. So we have these two waves, and this last wave is bigger than ever. People also call it psychedelic renaissance. And in this psychedelic renaissance, we observe a ever-growing spectrum of indications and mental health conditions that we apply psychedelics to, which also speaks to this great uh, potentials of psychedelics and many hopes that we attribute to these substances and these experiences that they produce. However, these experiences, despite potentials and hopes, do not come without any risks and challenges, which produce specific needs. And perhaps the most important, the biggest, more significant need out of all is the very need for psychedelic integration, which is what I will focus on from now on. Towards the end of me speaking, I will become more practical and leave you guys with some insights and practical implications. But for now, I will just focus on answering the question, what constitutes the need for psychedelic integration? As I myself, a couple of years ago, when I started to be interested in this subject, I was very surprised to not found any reliable source of information that will answer that question extensively. So I began my literature review, which resulted in a couple of papers already, and I want to share with you the conclusions and insight of it. When we speak about psychedelic integration, just like with psychedelics themselves, there are many names that we can cross. They vary depending on the context in which psychedelics are being used. So in the clinical settings, we can hear mostly about follow-up sessions or post-dosing procedures. In the ceremonial context, we can hear about morning after, for example, or in the festive settings, maybe we can hear about lending facilitation. All of them are basically speaking about bridging the gap between psychedelic experience and uh, individual daily life after the trip. Um, as I said before, there are many of information. The field is growing. Actually, plenty of very interesting papers and books have been published. And we developed some models of psychedelic integration and methods, specific methods of how to apply it in practice. But this question of what constitutes the very need for psychedelic integration, what we should even care, is, in my experience, not answered clearly. So I attempt to do it here. And all of the information that I found, I categorize into these um, four main pillars. So fasten your seatbelts because I will try to go through it quickly. It's also a subject of my specialization, and I devoted partially my PhD to it. So I do have a tendency to speak for days about it, but I will try to do it as fast as possible. First of all, psychedelic renaissance produced psychedelic hype, which is overly optimistic portraits of psychedelics, their potentials, psychedelic therapies, and so on. Um, this graph shows universal technological development curve. So when you think about, for example, internet, back in 80s, everyone were excited that it's going to revolutionize the whole world and we all will be connected and no schools will be needed because everyone will have access to information and so on. And fast forward a few decades, now we mostly hear about negative side of the internet, doom scrolling, producing social isolation, and so on. So what we can say is that after the trigger of the technology, which was the internet, there was this high peak of inflated expectation, then later drop with disappointment, and only afterwards really became integrated with daily life of a lot of people. Many people, me included, believe that we can attribute the same characteristics of technology development to psychedelics or psychedelic assisted methods of interacting with human brain and mind. And most of the time, people say that we are finding ourselves now somewhere around the peak of inflated expectations, which creates, of course, a lot of interest and acceptance of psychedelics in various contexts, which, on the other hand, is translated to the increasing number of people using psychedelics for different purposes in different places, different settings. To give you some evidence, this is one of the recent studies that shows increased prevalence in psychedelic use. And this particular study concerns only LSD and only among USA population. It compared trends in using LSD between 2002 and 2018 on a very large population or sample, and they found out an increase of over 200%. And this also should come with the comment that LSD has less popularity than it had back in 60s. So if we would look at psilocybin or other psychedelics, which are more popular nowadays, we'll perhaps see even bigger numbers. And to conclude this section, if more people are deciding to use psychedelics, and if psychedelics sometimes produce adverse reaction and negative outcomes, we will have more and more people who will be in the need for some kind of psychological or other support, which we actually call psychedelic integration. The second category of the needs for psychedelic integration is the very nature of a psychedelic trip. And this is perhaps the most interesting category. So hear me out. First of all, psychedelic experience effects doesn't end with the acute effects of the substance itself, but we observe a tendency to endure and lasting effects for the days or weeks after. We call it an afterglow. And within this time of the afterglow, you can have heightened mood, you can be more optimistic, you can experience relief in whatever symptoms you were suffering from previously. But other than that, other than just feeling better after using psychedelics, which happen oftentimes, some researchers also believe that this afterglow period is also a period of therapeutical window or neuroplasticity window, which makes a special opportunity for psychotherapeutic and other interventions to actually produce lasting beneficial effects. So if we think about mostly therapeutical context, what is happening after psychedelic experience might be a crucial time to introduce support and psychotherapy and other methods. Going further, paradoxically, whatever is happening during and after psychedelic experience, it doesn't last forever. This was maybe the best put by Jack Cornfield in the great book that I recommend you a lot to anyone who's interested in psychedelic integration. The book is called After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And the very beginning of the book goes like that. Enlightenment does exist. It is possible to be awakened. Unbounded freedom and joy, oneness with the divine, awaking into a state of timeless grace. These experiences are more common than you know and not far away. There is one further truth, however, they don't last. So, although it's actually easy for psychedelics and psychonauts to produce very intense experience out of quite passive behavior, which is just taking in psychedelic to your body, in order to maintain the benefits of psychedelic experiences, you actually need to put a lot of action and efforts. Going further, as William James said about religious experiences or mystical type experiences, although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seems to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. And as a rule, they carry with them a curious sense of authority. He called it a noetic quality of this non-ordinary states of consciousness, having this mystical qualities. And what he meant by that is that people under the influence of these substances or under the influence of these religious or mystical experiences, they experience high personal meaning and significance of whatever insights or perceptual changes is happening, and they sometimes even can feel like whatever is happening there is more real and more important than what they experienced back when they are sober again. And this quality makes people makes it difficult oftentimes to actually ignore what happened during the psychedelic experience. It stays with us, it requires some attention, and this nature of the psychedelic experience is also something that creates a need for psychedelic integration. And the last within this category is a dissonance between states or levels of consciousness. Uh, we know that under the influence of psychedelics, our consciousness can either shrink or go in a regressive state of mind or unconsciousness, or we can experience an opposite effect of transcendence or ecstasy. So whatever we go up or down, um, we go uh, out of this ordinary or non-altered or sober states of consciousness, call it as you wish. And this dissonance between the states of consciousness is what we want to integrate if it needs, if it requires some integration. Um, Jumping to this to the third category, this is an extensive, the most like large category and containing lots of risks and harms related to psychedelics. The main of which is, of course, challenging psychedelic experience, or as it's used to called, bad trips, which is just basically an overwhelming, very chaotic. And confusing state that can produce uh, mm, uh, lots of like overload and personal difficulties. For example, in the study back in 2016 conducted among people who were using psilocybin by researchers from Johns Hopkins University, in this large survey, they asked them about their psychedelic experience under psilocybin mushrooms, and about 40% of 2,000 study sample said that this experience, this last experience with psilocybin, was among the top five most difficult experiences of their life, which says a lot. However, interesting thing here is um, that I have to add is that about 80 few percent of these people who rated it as five most difficult also admit that they gain some benefits from the experience, which speaks to this specific unpredictable nature of psychedelic experiences. Uh, in many situations, however, after challenging psychedelic experiences, we can experience lasting symptoms of acute stress disorders, which are as follows, anhedonia, intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, flashbacks, dissociations, and so on. These symptoms can last for days or weeks or even longer, depending on the setting and the substance that was taken, of course. These symptoms have a tendency to fade away over time, but sometimes require serious professional support or even hospitalization. One of the very interesting and perhaps the goal of the psychedelic assisted therapy, one of the very interesting features of psychedelic experiences is that they can produce uh, a state under which we can recall a traumatic memory from the very past, and it can happen in a very vivid manner. And as I said, it's something that is very that is a very goal of psychedelic assisted therapy, for example. But when it happens under the settings in which we are not able to process it accurately, we don't have resources or so on, it can actually lead to re-traumatization and again be this harm related to psychedelic substances. Some minority of people experience the persistent perceptual changes, which is very interesting and still not well studied and well known consequence of psychedelic use. And on the other hand, others can experience an ontological shock, which is basically an overload of information and sensations under the influence of psychedelics, which confront and challenge whatever we were thinking about ourselves and the world and others around us, to the point that creates a prolonged confusion and this need to talk it through with someone maybe deep into a existential or broader philosophical literature and so on. And of course, it can create a lot of confusion and discomfort, to say the least. Next is a general category of worsening pre-existing mental condition or actually inducing mental health disorders. This is also not something that happens very often, but it is a real risk of taking psychedelics, just like the ego inflation, which is basically the opposite effect of what a lot of folks tries to achieve by overcoming or going beyond dissolving one's ego. Uh, what happens instead is they became inflated and take this narcissistic point of view that if I am experiencing something very unusual, then maybe there's something very unusual about me, and therefore I will treat others from above. And this is definitely a negative obstacle. We also observe among some people what can be called a spiritual bypassing, which is this situation in which we tend to drop responsibilities that we have towards others, towards work, towards family, and so on, justifying it by being on the spiritual path or dealing with a higher purpose and so on and so on. To everyone who don't believe that it is possible to feel attached to psychedelic states or to even develop kind of dependence, not addiction, but kind of dependence to psychedelic experiences, I recommend at least going through this interesting book from Christopher Bash, who wrote about his crazy experiment on himself, in which over the course of 20 years he took about 70 large doses of LSD, experimenting on himself, expanding the mind. And he was putting very detailed description after every trip. Out of this description, the whole book showed up. And towards the end of the book, he very clearly describes a situation in which he decided to stop the experiment because he felt very, very excited and connected and attached to what can wait or what is waiting for him behind next dose. So it was concerning for him enough to stop the experiment. It's a very interesting case. And the last, but unfortunately not least, what is also a huge risk related to psychedelic experiences is that after, under the influence of psychedelics, we get into this very vulnerable state under which we can be a victim of someone abuse, malpractice, or neglect. So it's something that creates many suffering as well. And to all of this negative, serious negative consequences of psychedelic substances, it is oftentimes the case that that it is not enough to deal with them on our own, and that we are going to need others, not necessarily professionals, but others to help us with processing and integrating this negative consequences. And the last category of what constitutes a need of psychedelic integration are sociocultural factors, which is to say, first and foremost, that the setting and whatever is whatever makes the conditions under which psychedelic experiences taking place is a very important, very significant influence on the content and the effects and the negative or positive consequences of psychedelic experiences. So one should never um, omit them or treat them as something less important than the substance itself or the dose. Uh, this includes also a situation, the social and cultural situation under which psychedelic experiences is happening. For example, if someone from Sweden or Poland goes to Amazonian forest and drinks ayahuasca there with people who they have no cultural connection to and don't speak the language and so on, even without drinking ayahuasca, this experience can be very challenging and require some integration afterwards. But if you add ayahuasca to it and this whole intense and vulnerable state that it brings us to, it creates even more need to take care of yourself and to integrate the experience. Also, recent research showed that the most actually common negative post psychedelic difficulty is in having a sense of social disconnection, like being feeling isolated, feeling like we are not understood, maybe some stigmatization and so on. So this is also something that is happening more around psychedelics, not within the individual experience itself. And mm, to finish this part, I would like to acknowledge that in most of our cultures on the West, we actually lack an adequate frameworks to understand and to make sense and to make use of psychedelic experiences, which is also a good subject to speak with whoever can support your psychedelic integration process. To sum up all of that, these four categories with everything that they consist, in my opinion, constitute what we can call a need for psychedelic integration. And now let's be more practical. I collected some insights over the course of my practice, my research, and my preparation for this very lecture as well. And I would like to share that with you now. There will be mostly tips for clinicians, but I believe everyone can benefit from them. So, first of all, implications for psychedelic integration practice. And what we understand by psychedelic integration, to speak as generally and broadly as possible, if we mean every conscious efforts to work with content or consequences of psychedelic experiences to either minimize and support others or ourselves with adverse effects of our psychedelic experiences, or to maximize or work towards maintaining the benefits of that very experience. This is very important distinction. In practice, it doesn't always show up easily because, as you know, the very nature of psychedelic experience can be more complicated than on the paper. But this distinction in theory inform the way to understand psychedelic integration in practice. Also, most of the people will tell you that psychedelic integration is something that starts when the psychedelic experience is finishing. But actually, the more you study and the more you practice it, you know that in the ideal circumstance, psychedelic integration actually starts from a preparation. Good preparation can help navigate through psychedelic experience, can benefit more from it, and can minimize potential risks and harms. Also, on the other hand, it is not easy to say when the process of psychedelic integration finishes. When I was trying to came up with a good solution to that puzzle with people with whom I cooperate to produce guidelines for psychedelic integration. we came up with twofold answer. First of all, usually psychedelic integration process uh, ends up with an open end, meaning that you might feel or decide that this is it, that whatever was needed to happen already happened, but you should never really close it because in 1 year, in 2 year, or in 2 months, or in 2 days, something can remind you about the trip, or you may have another intense experience, and this will reopen the content or the need for going back to analyze and to process the psychedelic experience that you were working before. Because the nature of psychedelic integration is that it unfolds, it can close and then unfold again and until infinity, I guess. And the second way in which we can conceptualize the ending of psychedelic integration, especially if it's happening in the context of therapy, is that it actually fades gradually into a regular psychotherapy process. When to distinguish that is also not easy. It's very individual. Not be completely serious, I would say that it happens when you stop speaking with your therapist about the psychedelic experience and and focus completely on your mom or whatever is that you are focused on the psychotherapy process itself. And here again, it should be treated as an open end because when psychotherapy starts, it doesn't mean that psychedelic integration will not go back to its previous purpose. So this is what I want to this is what I want to pass you here. And last, in this category, be mindful about the vulnerability of the person you support, as well as on your own worldview and paradigm in which you work. This is to say, stay humble and curious, because both interpersonal and iatrogenic harms can happen even if you are doing your best and you have good intentions to support. Um, uh, according to what I said before, we are witnessing psychedelic hype. So my implication, my recommendation here is to avoid being hyper enthusiastic about psychedelics and psychedelic integration or psychedelic experiences, but also let's avoid hyper skepticism because psychedelics have clear potentials. It's really hard at this point to negate them. But at the same time, they are not magic pills, they are not panaceas, and they are not the best solution for everyone at any time and in any case. So we should be very cautious here with not being overly enthusiastic or overly skeptical. Um, Also, the need for integration exists, as I was trying to prove here, but let's not exaggerate. And what I mean by that is that when I hear, every time I hear that whatever you take psychedelic, then you have like afterwards you have to call your integration coach or psychotherapist or doctor or whatever specialist or professional. I believe that we are exaggerating and creating an artificial need because at the end of the day, everything that we call psychedelic integration um, is in most cases happening intuitively, spontaneously, and without the need for a special care. Most of the time, according to at least my own clinical practice, people need to work with specialists, with professionals, with clinicians when they experience challenges after psychedelics, or if they are really serious about what they want to gain out of the psychedelic experience. But if we would take into account everyone who is experimenting with psychedelics, it will be really too much to say, and it makes me even like frustrated and having low tolerance to hear over and over that we have to integrate with specialists all of our psychedelic experience. So, guys, let's not create an artificial need here. Um, as I mentioned before, there are many models and methods of psychedelic integration already developed, proposed. Here are just some of the um, recent and good sources of knowledge on that. I'm not going to dive in there because it's for another lecture. I just want to share the fact that we are not starting from a void, but we already developed a lot. So I want you to use valuable models and methods of psychedelic integration because many of them are out there already, but also develop a new one. You know, if you are working in some particular approach or in particular methods and you didn't found any paper, any book, any academic or other mention about how to use this particular approach or method to work with psychedelics, well, um, part of the reason is that you didn't wrote it, you know, like it's maybe a bit cynical that I say that, but I see that it's not that some methods are extremely suitable for psychedelics and some are completely not suitable. I think that whatever we think of when we think about psychedelic integration, it's ultimately working with another person. So probably the majority or even all psychology and psychotherapy knowledge can be at least partially applied to psychedelic integration, but we don't see a lot of it published yet. But I do believe that the field is growing and we will see more and more ideas or on how to use the pre-existing methods to work with psychedelics themselves. And I encourage you to be also the one who uh, to develop them. Um, in some of the recent papers, an Australian team of researchers reviewed the ways in which clinical trials conducted psychedelic integration over the last 2 decades, if I'm not wrong. And what they found out is that in most cases, there was lack of integration or lack of description of integration with the psychedelic assisted therapy clinical trials. And in the other cases, one can distinguish two approaches. One is the non-directive approach, which is most of the time just focused on humanistic and experiential practice or trusting the process or inner healing intelligence. And in other cases, we see standardized approaches, which is basically using some evidence-based psychotherapy approach and applying it to work with psychedelic trip. And what this implies in your everyday practice is that the fracture between non-directive and the standardized approaches to psychedelic integration actually reflects the same fracture in the general field of psychology and psychotherapy. Psychedelics and psychedelic integration and psychedelic therapy is not specific, it's not special here. This fraction is not either or. Both approaches have their legitimate applications. For instance, you might use non-directive approach closer to the psychedelic experience and at the beginning of psychedelic integration when it's good to be less verbal, more experiential, more focused on grounding and providing basic support. And then when the process unfolds and you have more content, more practical insights, and you know what people want to change out of their psychedelic experiences, then maybe it's better to use some standardized approaches to facilitate and maintain the whatever benefits people have or whatever behavioral changes, for example, people want to apply it after psychedelics. And at the end, let's not focus on psychotherapy brands, but on specific methods and mechanisms of actions. Because actually, specific methods of therapy is what actually works, and specific mechanism of change is what actually make us understand what works. So we can all get better off focusing on what we were doing and what we think it really did to a person that we were supporting than to just say that we used some approach and be very not specific in that case. The last implication or recommendation here is that we can distinguish at least two dimensions of psychedelic integration. The first one is what we can call intrapersonal, which is focused on the individual, which is focused on what I can benefit and what's in it for me. In it, I mean what's in it with me, for me, out of the psychedelic experience and out of integration of the psychedelic experience. But it doesn't end here. There is also this interpersonal dimension, which tries to answer the question, how can we benefit and what's in it for us from my and from yours, from ours psychedelic experiences. To be honest, I find the second one probably probably much more important and significant to individual and public and social and communal good. But at the same time, it's almost completely omitted. No one ever speaks about it in terms of clinical trials and development of psychedelic assisted therapies or other applications, which led me over the last months and or if not years to developing this project that I am happy to invite you to take this chance speaking to you and invite you to the Psychedelic Integration project. Let me explain it very briefly. Just like the potentials of psychedelics doesn't end with the trip, the potentials of psychedelic integration do not limit to the individual. It goes far beyond the self, and we can describe this road from the within to the between. So seeing this domination of focusing on individual-centered discourse and practice and research on psychedelic integration and lack of reliable resources on something broader than that, I've launched this project to create a network for like-minded people to exchange knowledge and discuss and to collaborate on research, on publishing, on trainings, and to basically develop and push the whole field forward. So if you feel that this idea resonates with you, feel invited to join completely for free or reach out to me afterwards. I will happy to speak and to collaborate with all of you. Going back to my presentation, there are also some implications for research. I'm not going to speak long about it, but just briefly summarize what I think is also missing in the field, which is actually a very young field. Actually, if we can say that psychedelic renaissance is maturing, or in other words, if we can say that psychedelic field is maturing from its renaissance period, then the field of psychedelic integration is still in its infancy. And as such, it lacks of evidence base, which means that with the recommendations for research, I would not tell you that we need more research. We actually need the psychedelic integration research because not much was done yet. And I know that I am speaking now to at least two PhD students who are developing some psychedelic integration research. So it's great to see that this field is growing. And to everyone who is still like a bit distant or skeptical about the idea of examining and researcher exploring, examining, evaluating the process or the outcome of psychedelic integration practice, I want to tell you that difficult is not the same as bad. Because of course this research is going to be difficult, it already is. And also the skepticism is actually what you need to reliably apply a scientific method. So maybe you are the one to do it as well, or at least to support a research that is happening around you with that. There are many potential pathways in which that kind of research can take place. Even today, I summarized some of these ideas in the recently published paper in which I call for evidence-based psychedelic integration. So whoever wants to dive in deeper into the research into this field, growing field actually, and I send you back to this paper. And if you cannot find it, please reach out to me afterwards as well. So I know I gave you a lot of information, and that's why I want to finish with more imaginatory metaphor from the seed to the tree. So if we think about your intention to having a psychedelic experience being a seed, then planting the seed would be to have psychedelic experience. And from there, anything that happens the whole way from the seed to the tree can be called a psychedelic integration because a potential to be this great full-blown tree is already within the seed from the very beginning. So whatever we are doing for that process, either we are watering the plant or we are removing the obstacles or we are make sure that there is the access to the sunlight or we just basically give right conditions to this seed to grow to the tree, we are facilitating psychedelic integration process. In other words, there is no specialist that will integrate your psychedelic experience, but the supportive and the informed specialist can provide just the right conditions for you to harvest the fruits of your that grow under the that grow on the trees of your psychedelic experience, so that you can pick them up at the end and make a use or benefit out of these fruits in your daily life. This is the last note. And if you are interested in what I do or you want to collaborate, please feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, thank you for your attention.